Welcome to the premiere episode of Conversing on Africa's Peace, a new podcast produced as a collaboration between Amani Africa Research and Media Services and the Australian Embassy in Addis Ababa. My name is Adam from the Australian Embassy, and I'm joined by Dr. Solomon Durso, Founder and Executive Director of Amani Africa. Hello, Solomon.
Hello, Adam.
Solomon, firstly, let me say what a pleasure it is to be working with you. You and your work with the African Union Peace and Security Council and its associated work agenda is very well known here in AU circles. You're staples of the AU scene here in Addis, and your reputation for making a meaningful contribution to discussion and debate is well known. With that in mind, delighted to be able to say we're launching a new monthly podcast focused on Africa, peace and security issues. In simple terms, Solomon, just to sort of frame the scene a little bit, can you explain a little bit behind our motivation for starting this podcast and outline what people can hope to gain by becoming regular listeners to Conversing on Africa's Peace?
Thank you very much, Adam. It's really a great pleasure to join hands with Australian Embassy in Addis with you in launching and initiating this podcast. The idea behind this podcast is basically to bring to a wider audience, both the diplomatic circle in Addis, but broadly across the continent and beyond, about the important policy work of the African Union and particularly its Peace and Security Council on African peace and security issues. And in the process, it's not just about popularizing the work of the African Peace and Security Council, but also enabling wider diplomats and researchers, practitioners, not only to be updated about what's happening, but also for them to be able to plan their engagement and have an understanding, for example, for journalists, in terms of reporting on what the EU is doing and how it is doing it and why something is working or not.
Absolutely, and I think it's important work, and we hope to all our listeners that it does make that type of contribution. We acknowledge that it is a bit of a niche podcast, but we quite like that. Issues and topics, as Solomon says, we think are important, and if we can make them more accessible and digestible to our audience, we'll consider the podcast a success. We'll record a new one each month and share the details via our respective social media channels. The format will evolve as we go, but we'll focus on the monthly agenda of the PSC and other topics arising as we see fit. I think, Solomon, and I hope you agree, that this approach to our podcast will complement the other sort of more detailed analytical work that Amani Africa is already doing. Can you tell us briefly about the regular PSC reporting work that you do?
Thank you very much, Adam. Indeed, Amani Africa, as you rightly pointed out, is a leading source of information and analysis on the African Union's engagement on peace and security issues, particularly its Peace and Security Council. And in that respect, our work covers, for example, a very close tracking of the agenda of the Peace and Security Council on a monthly basis. And for each session of the Peace and Security Council, we produce what we call insights on the Peace and Security Council ahead of the convening of that session, in order to provide very succinct but comprehensive analysis that serves as a basis for planning for members of the PSC, for planning their session, but also their deliberations in the course of that session. So that is our flagship project, which we have been running since early 2018. There are other key deliverables that we have also. We have the monthly digest on the PSC, which actually provides a detailed analytical review of the outcome of the Peace and Security Council with a very critical eye as well on those outcomes, framing it in such a way that there would be a mechanism for follow-up and effective implementation of those outcomes of the Peace and Security Council, and also their subsequent consideration by the Peace and Security Council, as many of these items on the agenda of the PSC tend to be standing agenda items that the PSC follows periodically.
Yeah.
We have, of course, the annual production of the African Union Peace and Security Council handbook, which actually provides a very detailed and comprehensive as well as authoritative account of how the PSC works. And of course, we produce policy briefs as well as special research reports, which basically deep into specific current topics on peace and security issues of concern for Africa and in Africa. These are the foundations on which our podcast is framed in order basically to repackage many of these into a podcast that people would listen to as they drive and as they do other activities as well.
That's the aim, absolutely. And, you know, it's a significant output from you and your colleagues at Amani. Always high quality. And as somebody who was initially somewhat overwhelmed by the amount and the scope and the breadth of work undertaken by the Peace and Security Council, I can thoroughly recommend these Amani products just as, you know, a way to slowly wrap your head around the council, its work, and then so you can dive deeper. So before we actually focus directly on the August agenda of the Peace and Security Council, we thought it might be worth taking a little bit of a step back and providing a little bit of context and history. Most AU watchers will know that the AU is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year. What might be less well known is the fact that the Peace and Security Council also turns 20 this year. So for the uninitiated, Solomon, can you tell us briefly about the origins of the Peace and Security Council, the motivations behind its establishment and its work today?
Yes, this year marks the 20th anniversary of the launch of the African Union. As you may recall, the African Union's first convening of the summit happened in July 2002 in Durban, South Africa. It was at that summit, actually, a decision of the heads of state and government was taken on the establishment of the Peace and Security Council of the African Union. So one of the decisions of that summit was exactly this establishment of the Peace and Security Council of the African Union. In terms of the background or origin of the Peace and Security Council, obviously the thinking around Africa assuming responsibility for its peace and security goes all the way back to the establishment of the Organization of African Unity, the predecessor to the African Union, particularly with the ideas that was advanced by the president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, who championed the idea of how Africa uniting and also having its mechanism for the promotion of peace and security at the inaugural summit of the Organization of African Unity in May 1963. So it goes all the way back to them, and also in terms of the political thought behind it, you can associate it with the work of leading thinkers, such as, for example, the late Professor Ali Mazrui of Kenya, who authored a book actually on Pax Africana in the early 1960s, articulating the need for Africa to have a way of dealing with peace and security issues on the continent. So it goes all the way back. But within the framework of the Organization of African Unity, I think the establishment in 1993 of the mechanism on conflict prevention, management, and resolution in Cairo is the most important date for the evolution of the Peace and Security Council.
Gotcha.
That mechanism established the organ on conflict prevention, management, and resolution of the Organization of African Unity. And the Peace and Security Council actually took over from the organ of the Organization African unity. And at the time of the transition from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union, it's worth noting one thing, which is the decision taken that the African Union has to take greater responsibility in the prevention, management, and resolution of conflicts on the continent, considering that the establishment of peace and security is the foundation on which regional integration, development, and democratization would depend.
Indeed.
And of course, the backdrop to that is what happened in the 1990s, including the most horrific incident of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda.
Yes.
So that is really the background, and the decision was taken that we need to have a standing decision-making body on matters of peace and security, hence the establishment of the Peace and Security Council.
Very good. Thank you. Very interesting. Now, here we are, 20 years later. It's 2022 somehow. August is here. For some, a quieter month, they might go on leave or get out of rainy Addis for a couple of weeks, but it's certainly not the case that things are quiet at the Peace and Security Council. As we look at the agenda for August, we can see, a number of items listed for discussions. As you and your colleagues have been doing your work, what insights have you been able to gather, I suppose, in terms of the likely key issues to be managed by the Gambia during its time as chair? Can you give us a bit of an overview of the month? Where should we start?
Yeah, so the work of the Peace and Security Council is organized on the basis of the monthly program of work of the PSC, which basically sets the agenda of issues that would be considered during the course of the month. So for this month, August, as you rightly pointed out, Gambia is the chair of the month, which is a rotating position of the PSC. And there are 9 items on the agenda for the month of August. You can say that this is one of the largest number of PSC items for a month, indeed, despite the fact that, as you rightly said, August is supposed to be a low season for the PSC. It's not really a low season as such. So the first session would be the one involving the meeting between the Peace and Security Council of the African Union and the Permanent Representatives Committee, Subcommittee on Democracy, Elections and Human Rights. So this is relatively a new subcommittee of the Permanent Representatives Committee of the African Union, which had a mandate focusing specifically on issues relating to democratization, issues relating to governance. This is, as you know, one of the main areas of intervention of the African Union.
Yeah, sure.
And there is a convergence of the mandate of this subcommittee of the PRC with the mandate of the PSC, because the PSC's mandate, if you look at the PSC protocol, it clearly indicates and provides that the PSC have a role to promote democratic governance, constitutional rule, and human rights, at least within the framework of its preventive, that is, conflict preventive mandate.
Yeah. But
broadly speaking, if you look at the work of the PSC, when it comes to unconstitutional change of government, for example, which is a governance issue, the PSC is the organ of the African Union that actually initiates the response to unconstitutional change of government by way of, among others, suspending, for example, countries that experienced unconstitutional change of government, such as military coups, for example.
Yeah.
So this session basically is the first such session between the PRC subcommittee and the Peace and Security Council, and hopefully one of the issues, the major issues that they would reflect on, apart from sharing experiences, would be to look at the synergy between the peace and security work of the African Union and its democracy and governance work. So these two areas, because of the interlinkages between governance and peace and security, broadly speaking, the coming together of these bodies is important in enhancing the synergy between the African governance architecture and the African peace and security architecture.
That makes sense, and perhaps we can see that becoming, if not a regular item, at least something that will need to be examined more regularly going forward.
Okay. Now, so other areas that include, for example, there would be a report of the chairperson of the African Union Commission, which is a periodic report on elections in Africa that is submitted and considered by the PSC on a biannual basis. Initially, when this agenda item was established under the PSC, it was meant to be considered on a quarterly basis. But given the practicalities of quarterly reporting, now it has become a biannual. So at the beginning of the year and at the middle of the year, that is how this report is submitted. Of course, what it does is it provides a review of the elections that were held on the continent and the issues arising from those elections that were held in the continent, and also provides a preview of upcoming elections as well. This is the second session of the month, and then you have another new topic that will be on the third session, which concerns emerging technologies and new media.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Very interesting topic indeed, with a focus on impact of emerging technologies and new media on democratic governance, peace and security in Africa. I would say that this is the first time that this is featuring on the agenda of the Peace and Security Council. Not that the Peace and Security Council didn't pronounce itself on issues relating to the influence of social media, for example.
Yeah.
It did previously on
Fake news.
Exactly, on issues relating to fake news, infodemics during COVID, for example, or in relation to the use of the internet and the cyberspace, for example, for recruiting the use into the ranks of terrorist groups, for example. There were those references previously, but this, I think, would bring the focus into what new technologies and emerging technologies and new media, how it is transforming the lives of individuals and societies, and in the process, how it is also shaping peace and security dynamics. On its own, of course, it's not a problem, but it affects peace and security dynamics by how it avails completely new tools, both for those who would like to engage in violence and conflict, but also for those who would like actually to work for resolution of conflict. So it cuts both ways, but an important thing. That is I think the third one, and you can have a look at the other issues relating to, for example, on the briefing on the Horn of Africa. This is a briefing that is delivered by former President of Nigeria, Olusegun Obasanjo, with the High Representative of the African Union Commission Chairperson on the Horn of Africa, particularly with a focus on his role in trying to facilitate peace and security and trying to facilitate peace talks, particularly in the context of the Ethiopian conflict. That is also scheduled as part of the third session of the month. And then the fourth and fifth sessions center around the relationship between the PSC and the policy organs of regional economic communities, and then the African governance platform members and that of the Peace and Security Council. So it is kind of an institutional relationship focused sessions. These would be held on the 8th and 11th of August. On the 12th of August, Council will adopt the Provisional Program of Work for September. This is one of the working modalities of the PSC, that the program of work gets adopted earlier before the beginning of the month. It's one of the most important new developments over the years, actually. You have the sixth session focusing on the topical theme of sanctions and enforcement capabilities relating to the deterrence of unconstitutional change of government. As you know, unconstitutional change of government is one of the most topical agenda items on peace and security seen off the continent over the course of 2020-21 into this year. The 7 sessions would be on children affected by armed conflict. This is one of the standing agenda items of the PSC. The next one would be on the 22nd of August, lessons learning session on transitional justice. Basically, experience sharing, particularly focusing on the experience, among others, of the Gambia. The Gambia went through very interesting transitional justice process through the Commission on Truth, Reconciliation and Reparations.
Sure.
So that is on the 22nd. And then the last session of the month would be on the 29th of August, which would be focusing on the long-standing attempt to deploy 3,000 troops by the African Union into the Sahel. I think I would like to quickly end with a note highlighting the fact that there is, in the footnote of the program of work for August, indication that there may be discussions on, for example, the situation between, on the border situation between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Yeah.
That is one of the items put on the footnote that may be elevated to a session.
Yes.
These are the highlights of the month.
Thank you very much, Solomon. And I think it's probably worth going back and just diving a little bit deeper into a couple of those. I mean, we could go through them all, but for the sake of timeliness today, I'm interested in hearing more of your thoughts on the report presented examining African elections for the first half of 2022. I'd welcome your thoughts and analysis on the recent trends we're seeing in this sort of democratic space, election space.
Yes, that is one of the items that was actually rolled from previous months of the PSC. In terms of the trends, I think perhaps as part of the global trend in democratic regression, Africa has also experienced democratic regression in various ways. One of the manifestations of democratic regression on the continent is the fact that elections are not as they are expected, providing citizens the choices, real choices, in terms of leadership that would enable them to exercise self-government as citizens, to also be able to effect change of leadership and government. And what you end up having is basically often elections becoming a means of legitimizing the incumbent, and therefore not necessarily a means for changing government. And so we have these issues that many countries on the continent face. One of the examples, for example, which is featured on the expected to feature on the report, has to do with what was tried, for example, in Somalia. Somalia went through that experience.
Sure,
Somalia election was supposed to happen based on an agreement that was held in 2020, and it was supposed to happen a year and a half ago. But because the incumbent then tried to extend his stay in power and then created a very protracted electoral process as part of the incumbent really trying to find ways of continuing, to find ways of being elected into the position.
Right.
Although that didn't succeed, it is illustrative of the challenges of democratic elections. Elections have become a site for contestation. That's why you see elections attract a lot of dispute, but also violence as well. We have seen in various electoral contexts. There are, of course, not all elections are like that.
No, that's right.
There are a few elections where peaceful transitions did happen, for example, such as the case in Zambia last year, and indeed even in Somalia, despite the fact that the election was protracted. In the end, once the outcome of the election was known, the incumbent handed over power peacefully to the newly elected president. I think there are both trends, but the dominant trend is one of regression, in which elections are not really providing the real choices that citizens need and would like to have.
And I guess with that in mind, we wish the people of Kenya all the very best as they hold their elections within days of the recording of this podcast.
I wish them well.
Yeah. We've just had the AU mid-year coordination meetings in Zambia, which serves as an opportunity to sort of increase information sharing between the African Union and the regional economic communities. There's an agenda on this month. There's an agenda item for August, which is due to look at the PSC and ways to strengthen collaboration with the regional economic committees. Noting, the ongoing discussion, I suppose, about subsidiarity, about the relative strength and weakness of some of these institutions, and questions around, I suppose, policy coherence, particularly around conflict management is a prominent example. I'd welcome, any reflections you have on that agenda item and those relationships.
So indeed, one of the standing agenda items on the PSC since May 2018 is the relationship between the Peace and Security Council of the African Union and the policy organs of the regional economic communities and regional mechanisms. This is based on the provisions of Article 16 of the PSC protocol, which provides for the close working relationship between the PSC and the decision-making organs of regional economic communities, such as ECOWAS, SADC, or IGAD. These are the regional blocs that have both political peace and security, but also regional integration mandates. Mm-hmm. All right. Now, the question that you asked about subsidiarity, about policy coherence, and whether and how this would work. An attempt has been made, for example, through the communiques of the first consultative meeting between the PSC and the policy organ that was held in May 2018, and since then on a yearly basis, except during COVID in 2020. Yeah. They have outlined the base ways and means and the modalities for close coordination between the PSC and the regional bodies. Among others, for example, providing for the convening of meetings on specific agendas of interest and focus. Also undertaking visits to the different regions. And therefore, when the PSC undertakes a visit, for example, let's say it can be to Somalia, then it would be joined by, and it would have an involvement of the concerned regional body. So those are the kinds of things. Now, practically speaking, I think there is a lot of progress that have yet to be made in this respect, because the different regional blockings, they are not in the same level of development. Yeah. So there are some, like for example, ECOWAS or SADC, who have well-functioning institutions, others not necessarily. Sure. There is also the issue of, for example, whether or not they have standards that are comparable to the standards of the African Union. When it comes to unconstitutional change of government, for example, the African Union tries to coordinate with ECOWAS for countries in ECOWAS. But there is no way that the African Union can be able to coordinate on unconstitutional change of government with IGAD, because IGAD doesn't have a norm banning unconstitutional change of government. Sure. So when it comes to unconstitutional change of government happening in the Horn of Africa, the African Union has to go it alone. It can't wait, for example, for IGAD to pronounce itself on that. Gotcha. So that's why on Sudan, you clearly see the AU going it alone. When it comes to Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea, you see
it's different. Yeah.
Completely different. Then the effort to coordinate. Obviously, there are questions whether or not the African Union, for example, or or the Peace and Security Council should wait until a decision is made by a regional body.
Sure.
And what if that decision is not coming? But importantly, what if that decision is not in compliance with the EU norms and standards?
Yeah.
What is the peace going to do? So there are very interesting questions that this gives rise to. But the important point is the imperative for achieving policy coherence between the two. Because I don't think that the PSC by itself alone or the regional bodies by themselves alone can effectively address the peace and security challenge on the continent. Also because there are certain issues that actually straddle between different regions. So if you see, for example, Boko Haram, it's not just in West Africa, it's also in the Central African region. When you have those kinds of issues, obviously you can't necessarily confine things to the relationship between the PSC and one regional body, but broadly all others.
Indeed. It would be remiss not to take a quick look at the sanctions question. Sanctions as a deterrence against unconstitutional changes of government. Always a contentious issue. Why is this so important or topical at the moment? In a couple of minutes.
Well, this is a very important point. Indeed, from a policy perspective, particularly when it comes to responding to unconstitutional change of government, one of the issues with which members of the Peace and Security Council struggled over the course of the 2021, as you remember, that is the year when the highest number of coups happened on the continent, with 5 countries having been affected by coups. 4 of them basically ended up being suspended by the Peace and Security Council from the African Union.
Yeah.
And what that gave rise to is the question. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, and the African Union, when the event in Mali happened, they imposed a suspension. They suspended Mali. But it never deterred the military in Guinea from staging a coup.
Yeah, shortly after. Following
No, exactly.
Yeah.
It didn't deter Sudan from engaging in that.
Yeah.
It didn't deter, in the end, even Burkina Faso early in the year.
Yeah.
So the questions have been asked. Why is it that these mechanisms are not responding or are not as they used to deter effectively, whether sanctions do work and should work? And there are debates within the Peace and Security Council, obviously, among different members of the PSC over the course of the past year. But the central point is, first, unconstitutional change of government. As far as unconstitutional change of government is concerned, there is a zero tolerance policy.
Yeah.
And as part of that policy, there are consequences that are attached actually by the grand norm of the African Union, which is the Constitutive Act. And therefore, that idea of suspension and sanction would start. The question is, how do you enforce it? How do you make it work? For that, obviously, there are questions about whether or not there is adequate consensus among members of the African Union in order to fully support. Once the sanction is imposed, everybody has to come around for it to be effective. If everybody is not around, then of course it wouldn't be effective. The other thing is also from a perspective of the population, the public, broadly speaking. When the African Union imposes sanctions or ECOWAS imposes sanctions, it leads to opposition. And we have to ask the question on whether or not actually the African Union or ECOWAS should wait until a coup happens, actually do something, upstream on the circumstances and conditions that actually precipitate coups. That is an important aspect of the equation that needs to be looked at.
I think the early warning or the early mover topic is likely to be a topic of an entire episode of this podcast at some stage in the future. Before we wrap it up, if there's a meeting on the border tension between Democratic Republic of the Congo and Rwanda, briefly, what will be discussed or how will that sensitive issue be handled, do you think?
So, on that one, I think it is one of the topical and concerning peace and security developments of recent months, as you know. The good thing about it is basically that the region, both the International Conference of the Great Lakes region as well as the East African community, they have been active, seized with this matter, and they have actually both initiated a process for addressing these issues. The first is, of course, addressing the conflict and the fighting that is ongoing in the Eastern DRC, which actually implicates and affects the neighboring countries bordering Eastern DRC. That is an issue that is being handled by the East African community under the Nairobi process. And then the tension that this has triggered in the relationship between Rwanda and the DRC in the Malabo Summit in May 2022, the African Union, as you may recall, interested the chairperson of the International Conference of the Great Lakes region, IFGLR chairperson, President of Angola, to facilitate a process between Rwanda and the DRC. And a high-level trilateral summit was held, on the basis of which a roadmap was outlined, and there are efforts that are ongoing. But despite these efforts, some of the incidents that are happening in Eastern DRC are becoming increasingly concerning, and the contribution of the Peace and Security Council would obviously be to find ways and means of supporting both the Nairobi process and the Luanda process, and help bring the weight, the diplomatic weight of the broader African Union membership to bear in order to help these countries avoid further escalation and indeed, if possible, achieve resolution of the situation.
Absolutely, a really important issue and one to keep an eye on. Thanks, Solomon. While we could sit here for hours, unfortunately that's all we have time for. I should just say that as a bit of a disclaimer, the views expressed here are the views of Solomon and myself and other participants, should we have guests, not of the Australian government. Before we go, I just want to wish the following African countries happy Independence Days. August is a bit of a bumper month. We have Benin on the 1st of August, Niger for the 3rd, Cote d'Ivoire for the 7th of August, Chad for the 11th, and the Republic of Congo for the 15th of August, and Gabon for the 17th of August. We wish you all peace and prosperity.
Thank you very much for listening to us. You listen to Conversing on Africa's Peace, a monthly podcast prepared jointly by the Australian Embassy in Addis Ababa and Amani Africa. We look forward to you joining us again next month.